And thank you all for making it out this morning. I know that last night might have been a late night for some of you. So I'm really excited to be here to talk about some of my favourite things with you. I think helping people appreciate their cultural heritage is one of the best jobs in the world. So I think I'm really lucky to be here with other people working towards the same goal. This paper is really a chance to remind ourselves why we should get audiences participating digitally. How does it benefit galleries, libraries, archives and museums and their audiences? I'm going to take you through some examples of digital participation and explain why I think they make useful case studies. I'll finish by summarising what we can learn from these case studies, looking for tips that you can take back to your organisations. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions and discussion at the end. So, in an era where we have to justify the expense of every penny or euro, why enable participation? Isn't it easier just to keep doing what we're already doing? Perhaps not. I'm going to start by looking at some of the problems that your organisation might be facing. We're really, really good at doing participation already, but we need to think digitally to enable participation at scale. If we want to reach hundreds of thousands of people rather than tens or hundreds of people. We've got lots of experience with access and participation with people at reference desks, in galleries, at events. We're good at creating experiences to engage, delight and educate in person, but these are limited by the number of staff required, the materiality of the objects or documents, the size of the venue, the location of the venue, opening hours. Digital projects don't experience these difficulties. When we're still learning how to translate this kind of really brilliant, fun experience into something in the digital domain. So you probably know this, that collections are big, sometimes quite big, and resources are sometimes quite small. In most cases, we're still digitising our catalogue records, let alone at the stage of taking beautiful images and writing wonderfully contextualised interpretive records for those objects. We'll be at it for centuries if we try and do it alone. So where's my happiness? It's not enough for content to be online, it has to be discoverable. Hits for happiness. I'm not really sure what appears to be a helmet, a brew, these documents. These aren't the kinds of things that are going to engage me when I find this resource. But if other people had tagged these objects with concepts like happiness, cute puppies, joy, friendship, then I might have had a better chance of finding them. This is an example of the semantic gap. There's the language that cataloguers use, and there's the language that ordinary people use. And they don't often match up. So even when people find your resources, assuming they've gotten over that first part of the semantic gap, they're not necessarily engaged by what they find on the page. It's difficult for us to explain fully, for every kind of audience, what's interesting about our content, what's significant about it, why is it relevant to their lives. We tend to catalogue because we're cataloguing for posterity, we're cataloguing for preservation and recording. But we can work with our audiences to help fix that semantic gap. So I'm sure this is a wonderful record, but I have no way into this. I don't understand why it's significant. I don't understand why it's in different languages, why it's in different typefaces, who wrote it, why they wrote it. Even the metadata that we might have doesn't do a good job of linking into other data sets that might help explain that. So that's where things like linked open data can help. Also in Europeana's case, we've got multilingual issues. We've got, 27, 29 different languages to deal with. We've also got language that's changed over time, so the language that kids today might use to look for content will be different than the language that specialists will use to look for content, will be different to the language that the content's actually catalogued in. So those are some of the problems that we're trying to solve, and I think digital participation is really good at helping solve those particular problems. So one of the sort of most obvious reasons is that digital participation is core to our mission. I've looked at some of the mission statements from various museums, libraries and archives. These are some of the words that frequently occurred. The benefits of audience participation are both tangible and intangible. Exactly how they relate to your mission and how they can be measured in relation to your mission will depend on your organisational context and mission. But don't forget that access may not be enough if your content isn't discoverable and if it's not engaging. Okay, so a really obvious one is that digital participation increases traffic. It not only helps more people find your content, it helps people stay on your collections pages longer, they engage with your material longer, they return more often. They might even turn into physical visitors. If they didn't know that your museum had a brilliant painting by an artist that they like, they'll never know to visit it. But once they've found it, I've heard of people actually planning holidays around museums and galleries that they've discovered. And also, if you work with family historians, they will actually plan holidays around this. So people might turn into physical visitors, they might even buy something from your store. With all the challenges that cultural heritage organisations face at the moment, if we can turn audiences into advocates, then we're in a good position to argue our case for increased funding and in some cases for continuing to exist. At the Science Museum, we knew that many people would forget about museums in the time between being a child and going to the Science Museum and the time between having children of their own and they'd return to the museum. So that's maybe 20 or 30 years that we're not reaching those people. But these are the people that we can often reach with digital projects. When people have benefited directly from your resources, they'll become fans, they'll become advocates, they'll tell friends about them. You're no longer dusty old stuff in boxes. You're their history, you're part of their lives, you're part of how their future is going to come to be. When you encourage people to engage in meaningful, participative work, they gain a sense of ownership and pride. These intangible outcomes can be as important as the content that's created through audience participation. It's also a chance to let audiences see the full complexity of what you do, to see how much work goes into providing the access and interpretation that they might take for granted, to help them understand that what they see on the shelves or in the galleries is just the tip of the iceberg. There are also more experts outside your museum than within, which is certainly in no way putting down the expertise within your museum, but the world is huge, and curators are increasingly harassed and running out of time. So the kinds of knowledge that is outside the museum, that some of it is accessible to curators if they had infinite time, and some of it is just inaccessible. It's things like, what was it like to drive that car? What was it like to work on the munitions factory? What was it like to live in that place at that time? We can't know all that, but there are people out there who can. If we can reach them, then we can help them share their experiences with us. So what we need to do is we need to open up and let people share that knowledge and that experience with us and not be challenged by that. It's not a competition. It's a matter of finding ways in which we can complement what's inside the museum with the knowledge outside the museum. Finally, the rest of the world is moving from broadcast to dialogue and interaction. If you spend any time around kids, you might have seen the ways in which they interact with screens. Phones that aren't touch phones, televisions that don't pinch and zoom. To kids who've grown up in a digital world, screens that don't interact with them are broken. So we need to think about what the expectations of our audience that they bring with them when they walk through the door of your institution. Okay, it's all very well saying that audience participation creates a deeper sense of engagement, but rather than tell you, I'd like to show you. So if you'll indulge me, being early in the morning, with a little thought experiment. First of all, I want you to imagine taking a photo of an object in a museum. Okay, think about that moment. You've probably all done this. How many times do you find yourself going back to that photo and looking at it? How much do you actually remember about that object? Do you find yourself thinking about it later? Do you find your friends commenting on it and saying, wow, I never really realized how great that painting was? Okay, now I want you to imagine sketching that object. I was in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Dijon this week, and they had a sketching station, which you can't see it, it's a not very good drawing, presumably by a child. But someone sat there and has drawn this object. So as you draw, you find yourself engaging with the particular materiality of the object, the details of its construction, the way that time has affected it. You may start wondering about the intention of the creators, what it was like to use it or to experience it in everyday life. In having an active relationship with that object, you've engaged more deeply, perhaps even changed a little as a result. New questions may have been raised that you find yourself pondering. You may even decide to find out more, to start your own research, or to share your feelings with others. Perhaps surprisingly, even the act of tagging an object in an online game or in an online interface has a similar effect, perhaps because you have to look at something enough to engage with it to say something about it. Okay, and quite simply, engaging with cultural heritage content is rewarding for audiences. There's a saying in game design that learning is actually the fun, that learning is the drug in games. There are many reasons why. I think these ones are particularly relevant to this kind of participation. This is from a games researcher, Jane McGonigal. You might have seen her TED talk. She says, people crave satisfying work to do, the experience of being good at something, time spent with people that we like, and the chance to be part of something bigger. I think participation in cultural heritage projects can meet all those needs. Okay, the Centre for the Advancement of Informal Science Education came up with these top 3 forms of participation based on public participation in science research. Nina Simon of the Museum 2.0 blog mapped them to museums in the cultural sector and added platform as an additional form of participation. So most GLAM user-generated content projects are contributory. The projects are designed by the organisation, the interfaces are designed by the organisation, the content is provided by the organisation, and the public merely contributes data, which is actually great. For a lot of projects, that's all you need. But you can also have collaborative projects where the audience or the public may be active partners in some of the decisions about the project, but it's still led overall by the organisation. In co-creative projects, partners define the goals together. So in a science research project, it might be that the research methods are discussed and decided together, or the specific research questions. I think it's slightly harder for particularly museums to manage this kind of process because they have so much information about how audiences respond to objects, how exhibition design works, that it's difficult for them to let go and to really say to the public, go crazy, do what you like. So these kind of co-creation projects probably fall more into the collaborative concept than the co-creative. And finally, platform is venues, organisations as a venue or as a host for other activity. It might be letting bloggers or tweeters have a meet-up in your cafe. It might be hosting a Mother's Morning. It could be things like Lates events. But it can also be online, and we'll look at an example of that later on. It's also important to remember, and this is kind of based on many conversations with people who are like, why do we need user-generated content? I don't care whether someone likes this object or not. There are many kinds of participation, and for some of them, the value lies mostly in the act of creation for the individual who's created it. At the Science Museum, notoriously, we'd have lots of people commenting saying, I like this robotic fish. Great. It's great for them. The fact that they've engaged, that they've expressed an opinion, suggests a level of engagement. For the reader, it doesn't necessarily help them very much, particularly when there's 500 kids who said the same thing that day. But for those kids, they've said something in the Science Museum and it's on the screen and it's great for them. But there are other kinds of content where people actually add something that has a wider value, that has a value for other visitors. Sometimes when people include new facts or an interesting personal story about an object. Taking this further, you can design participatory projects so that each contribution helps meet a defined goal, particularly in crowdsourcing, when you're designing carefully scaffolded tasks, by which I mean tasks where what you have to do, how you have to do it, when it's finished, what the results are going to be, is very carefully shown to the user in ways that are appropriate on the screen. So those scaffolded tasks, so that the general public can contribute to a shared goal. There's a big difference between a big empty page that says, please comment, and something that says, tell us about the first time you saw one of these, or tell us about what you know about how these were made. The more precisely you design a task, the easier it is for an audience to engage in it. Crowdsourcing in cultural heritage tends to be mostly contributory rather than collaborative or co-creative. So these are the types of content that you might get. we're going to consider, perhaps if you're going to the crowdsourcing session, some of the other sessions, you'll be hearing about different kinds of content, and there are various different ways of looking at how this content is created. Okay, so in the case studies, I've chosen 2 established examples and 2 experimental ones. I wanted to demonstrate both how established digital participation is, but also have a look at where it's going. So it's the old favorite, it's Flickr Commons. You've probably already seen this. But it's a really great reminder of how effective just the act of sharing content in places where people hang out can be. So my first tip is go fishing where the fish are biting. Find the digital spaces where people are already engaging with similar content and put your content there. So you can see from the number of views here, the number of comments, the number of favorites, the number of notes, that it's a really effective way of getting your content to people. Even though the Commons has been going for a while, people are still finding much higher levels of discoverability, of traffic and of user contributions on the Commons than they ever would have had on their own websites. This one's also a really nice example of the public helping identify a location. So people had a look, they found images of this building as it is now, they described what's next to it, what's just out of shot. There's also some really lovely personal stories about people who'd been to this place, someone whose mother was a waitress and she met her father when she worked there, and from the family who actually ran this place as well. And those kinds of comments are really interesting. They make that place come alive. I almost want to go there now. I want to see what it was like to hang out in that space in the 50s and in the 30s. Okay, so this is Trove from the National Library of Australia. Trove was designed specifically as a crowdsourcing interface. So crowdsourcing was first defined as exploiting the spare processing power of millions of human brains. It also goes back to the Clay-Shirky idea of cognitive surplus, or the idea that X number of television hours are the equivalent to Wikipedia. Crowdsourcing is also generally considered to involve work that would normally be done in-house. So tasks like this OCR correction that require the judgment or complicated visual processing are perfect for crowdsourcing. It's quite difficult for computers to get this right. It's easier for us to do it. So here's a screenshot of some corrected data. Crowdsourcing can solve real problems. It can help scientists identify galaxies and proteins that can save lives. It can provide data about climate change through history. In this example, crowdsourcing is correcting OCR errors. The correction here is quite subtle. It was that, and now it's, oh, here it is. Hawthorn Coast, Hawthorn, East Melbourne. As someone who's from that area, I can tell you that that small difference suddenly makes that record make a lot more sense. And also, if you're looking for East Melbourne, you wouldn't have found it before, and now you will. And I actually made that correction, and making that correction felt good. It was a small act, it was something simple that I could do, and now something's a bit more right in the world, which as a geek is always a nice thing. So I think Trove is 2 years old. By February 2011, they had 20,000 people helping out. That's 20,000 people taking a moment out of their day to correct something that they saw that was just a bit wrong. 30 million lines of text are being corrected in 2 years. So this is a particularly well-designed interface for this kind of task. If you see an error, right here is fix this task. You don't need to sign up. You can sign up if you want to, but you sign up because you want a record of all the corrections that you've made. It's not about the organization getting more information about you. It's about you having a personal relationship with something. It's worth you signing up. So having a really clear call to action in the place where it should be is one of the sort of main design tips that I take from this. One of the interesting things about Trove is they've also got a forum where people who are making corrections can chat, or where people who are using these newspapers online in their research can chat. So again, its cultural heritage organisation, its library as platform. They're hosting a conversation between people working on similar material. They don't need to inject themselves into the conversation. They've just created a space where the conversation can happen. So crowdsourcing is great. But as it gets more popular, you'll be competing for what we might call participation bandwidth with other projects. People will be deciding whether to work with your site or with something else that meets your needs. And we found this at the Science Museum. We had an object wiki. And when we did research on it, we found that specialists would rather go and work on Wikipedia than on our site because more people would see their work on Wikipedia. And they weren't quite sure how committed we were to the project. They weren't sure what was going to happen to the information afterwards. So you're going to hear about other crowdsourcing games. And one of the reasons is that crowdsourcing games really act as participation engines. They drive participation. So this is a small tagging game that I made. I researched, designed it, programmed it in my evenings and weekends. Very small scale. But the point is you don't need to be a huge organization to do this kind of stuff. So by definition, crowdsourcing games should produce meaningful, accurate metadata as a side effect of enjoyable gameplay. So they must be both useful and enjoyable. Because fun is personal, because some people like solitaire and some people like World of Warcraft, you need to test these games with your target audience until you know that they're actually fun. Worthy isn't really good enough. Museum games in particular have kind of gotten away with being worthy or educational for a long time. There's too much competition out there now. We need to be better. Crowdsourcing games can also increase the number of overall contributors because they're so accessible. In my research, I found that as soon as we had what's called the magic circle here, as soon as there was a sense of it's a game, people knew what they had to do, and all the normal reservations they have about participating in museum projects, putting their content in a cultural heritage space, disappeared. It was actually almost eerie to watch how effective this was. So you can have more people contributing. They'll stay longer, they'll contribute more, they'll bring their friends into play as well. If games aren't suitable for your audiences, you can still adopt some of the characteristics of games. So a nice clear task to start with. There's a kind of backstory here that relates to the character. But again, like Trove, fix this error. It's nice, clear, there's no ambiguity. You know when you've done it. Good feedback on the results of your actions, the sense of mastering new skills, and also providing interesting problems to solve. Continuing the theme of openness that has been in this conference so far, I should point out this project was only possible because the Science Museum and the Powerhouse Museum had APIs on their object records. So I was able to create a game that united their astronomy collections without ever having to negotiate a partnership or a licensing agreement. Okay, so this is just an example, very small scale project, but if you put the content, if you put the call to action where people are, so Facebook, where people presumably have a bit of time on their hands, they're also used to seeing games on Facebook. So in 6 hours, I got that much data. So back to this idea of active engagement, and this is one of the quite interesting findings about my research. People were learning about and discussing obscure objects while they were tagging them. They particularly liked making a difference. Some of them kept playing object after object because they liked exploring the collections in a fun environment. So dwell times on these games were up in the 10-minute range instead of the less than 1 minute range for most museum collection sites. Okay, so the final example is something I worked on this just before I left the Science Museum, but I can't claim any credit for all the work that's been done since then, and I haven't seen any of the internal evaluation on the project. This machine here is the Aramix machine. It's an early music synthesizer. If you're into early electronic music, it's brilliant. If you're not, what? What do you do with that? How do you look at that? The Science Museum wanted to interpret this object, but they knew that they needed help. It's all about how it sounded, not how it looked. But the object is too fragile to restore into working order. So they worked with a national youth theatre, they worked with electronic musicians, they worked with some of the people who'd worked in the BBC's Radiophonics workshop and worked on the original object, because they wanted to understand how they could explain the significance of this object, how to bring it to life for new audiences. Okay, so this is the National Youth Theatre. They got really into it. They had a Facebook page, they had a Twitter page. They really engaged and they kind of spread this content around. They had, I think, 7 performances in the Science Museum. So far so good. It's kind of traditional, even though the method of getting there isn't quite so traditional. It's a performance in a museum. There's also an exhibition in a museum. But what I think is really interesting is that engaging in this project created a platform for community. So these people here, I like this comment, it's so nice being able to talk about this music with people. I always felt I was researching in a vacuum. They've made a space where people can talk about this subject. And to quote Clay Shirky again, in 2009 he told the Smithsonian 2.0 workshop, "It's possible that the artifact itself has created a surface to which people adhere. Every artifact is a latent community." So some quick tips. Have an answer to the question, why would someone spend time on this project? Why are they going to give up their time to spend time here when there's so many other things they could be doing? Be inspired by things people love. Design for the audience that you want. Make participating pleasurable. It's not enough to be worthy. It should actually be fun to do as well. Don't add unnecessary friction and barriers like long registration processes. If it doesn't need to be in there, don't put it in. Validate procrastination. This is one of the findings of my research, where people were kind of like, I feel okay about sitting down for 5 minutes with a cup of tea because I'm doing something good. I'm not slacking off. I'm actually helping a museum. Show how much you value contributions. So a lot of these sites will say X number of records have been digitized by Y people, because what they're showing is this is real data that's being generated and it's being used. Okay, so probably the main tip there is allow for community management resources. Have someone there to answer questions, to prompt people. Don't make it look like a graveyard. And we often forget to plan for these ongoing resources when we're designing projects. We sort of finish when it launches, but that's not quite enough. Realistically assess fears. Decide whether they meet acceptable risk, and then go ahead or don't. But face them and then make a decision on that basis. So fish where the fish are. Decide where it's okay to lose control. Maybe you don't need to control everything after all. And perhaps don't do it alone. Find partnerships, find other people who are doing the same thing. So, most of all, I'd just like to say, enjoy it. It's really fun. Thank you.